Hey everyone, I'm John Maple and welcome back to JW Review. In our last video, we took a look at one of the 3 claims that the Jehovah's Witness leadership make to establish their authority over the entire religion of Jehovah's Witnesses. We looked at the first claim, that there existed a 1st century governing body and that therefore there needs to be a modern day governing body. If you haven't seen that video yet, you can click the info card above or the link in the description below. Today, we'll be looking into their second claim, that Jesus spoke prophetically of a small group of men that would act as modern-day leaders of his people, called the faithful and discreet slave. The teaching of the faithful and discreet slave is really important in the organization. It is the teaching that Jesus, in a speech given to his disciples, spoke of a faithful and discreet slave that the master, Jesus, would use to feed his domestics, other Christians. Jehovah's Witness leadership have interpreted this statement made by Jesus as a prophecy, one that would point to someone or some group leading the worldwide Christian congregation and providing spiritual food at the proper time. Now, what does this have to do with the governing body? Well, for several years, the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses taught that the faithful and discreet slave was made up of all anointed Jehovah's Witnesses around the world. However, in the July 2013 Watchtower, in the article, "Who Really Is the Faithful and Discreet Slave?" that teaching changed. In keeping with Jesus' pattern of feeding many through the hands of a few, that slave is made up of a small group of anointed brothers who are directly involved in preparing and dispensing spiritual food during Christ's presence. In recent decades, that slave has been closely identified with the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. So, from that time on, the faithful and discreet slave referred only to the governing body itself. This is important because it essentially puts the leaders of the Jehovah's Witness organization in the place of God, claiming that they are the channel that Jehovah and Jesus are using, and that our spiritual health and our relationship with God depend on our obedience of them. So, why has the governing body assumed this role of the faithful slave? As mentioned before, the whole teaching of the faithful slave rests on their interpretation of 2 scriptures, Matthew 24, 45 through 47, and Luke 12, 42 through 44. Both of these scriptures are Jesus' words on the faithful slave. The organization teaches that these 2 scriptures found in Matthew and Luke are prophecies made by Jesus. Let's take a quick read of both of these. Matthew 24, 45 through 47 says, "Who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom the master appointed over his domestics to give them food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master, on coming, finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings." Luke 12, 42 through 44 says, "And the Lord said, Who really is the faithful steward, the discreet one, whom his master will appoint over his body of attendants to keep giving them their measure of food supplies at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. I tell you truthfully, he will appoint him over all his belongings." So right off the bat, do any of these 2 scriptures sound like a prophecy? Does Jesus ever say it's a prophecy or refer to any specific detail of how it would be fulfilled? To me, it doesn't. Maybe to you it doesn't either. So why do witnesses say that it's a prophecy? Well, the governing body claim that because in verse 3, Jesus gets asked by his disciples about the sign of his presence, then that must mean that from verse 4 through to the end of the chapter, Jesus is foretelling the events that will happen in the future, including the appointment of a faithful and discreet slave. But a quick look and we can see that this is not the correct context. Yes, Jesus does begin verse 4 by foretelling future events, but he stops predicting the future in verse 31. After that, he gives an illustration of the fig leaf, reinforces the idea that nobody knows the day or the hour in which the things that he predicted will happen, and then stresses the importance of keeping on the watch. What follows this is finally his words on the faithful and discreet slave. Biblical scholars agree that Jesus' words about the faithful slave were just a parable or an illustration, and not a prophecy. It was designed to show his disciples the importance of always being on the watch and acting faithfully as if they were expecting Jesus' return at any moment. We know this to be the case because Jesus immediately continues his illustrations in chapter 25 with the parable of the 10 virgins, the talents, and the sheep and goats, all designed to teach the same thing. But what about Luke 12:42 through 44? Well, once again, not only is there no mention of this being a prophecy, but verse 40 again reinforces the idea of being on the watch, because nobody knows the day or the hour. And then, in verse 41, Peter asks Jesus if he's telling these illustrations to only his disciples or to everyone, clearly establishing that the very next verse is in fact not a prophecy, but an illustration to teach the disciples about being on the watch. And it makes sense that this would have been the understanding that the disciples would have had regarding this illustration. What's more likely? That the disciples would have understood this as an illustration on the importance of being on the watch, striving to be faithful and discreet like the slave from the parable? Or that Jesus was talking about a group of elderly men in New York City leading his disciples in the 21st century? Nowhere in these two scriptures do we find any prophetic pattern or prophetic type with a future antitypical fulfillment. And that brings me to my next point. Let's talk briefly about types and antitypes. The way I understand it, a type is a representation, event, or prophetic pattern of something that will come to pass at some future time. The antitype is the fulfillment of the thing that the type represents. In Watchtower's case, the prophetic pattern left by Jesus about the faithful slave is the type, and the modern-day governing body filling the role of the faithful slave would be the antitypical fulfillment. Interestingly enough, listen to how David Splain, who is a member of the governing body, explains the organization's view on types and antitypes.
Who is to decide if a person or an event is a type if the Word of God doesn't say anything about it? Who is qualified to do that? Our answer? We can do no better than to quote our beloved brother Albert Schroeder, who said, "We need to exercise great care when applying accounts in the Hebrew Scriptures as prophetic patterns or types if these accounts are not applied in the Scriptures themselves." Well, in recent years, the trend in our publications has been to look for the practical application of Bible events and not for types where the Scriptures themselves do not clearly identify them as such. We simply cannot go beyond what is written. Where the Scriptures identify them as such, we embrace them. But where the Bible is silent, we must be silent.
So, the context of both scriptures found in Matthew and Luke show us that this is nothing more than a parable or illustration, and the Bible itself does not clearly identify it as a prophetic type. That should be it then, right? But for the sake of argument, let's take a look at some of the proof that Watchtower offers to show that there really is a biblical precedent for a faithful and discreet slave. This one actually took me quite a while to find. I even asked a few friends of mine to help me search for any piece of evidence that the Watchtower has presented to back up their claim of being the faithful and discreet slave. And after a bit of searching, we were finally able to find one article in the 1981 Watchtower titled, "Do You Appreciate the Faithful and Discreet Slave?" And all it is this: a list of supposed prophetic types that point to the antitypical fulfillment of the faithful slave doctrine since the year 1919, which we can all discard because...
Well, in recent years, the trend in our publications has been to look for the practical application of Bible events and not for types where the Scriptures themselves do not clearly identify them as such. We simply cannot go beyond what is written. Where the Scriptures identify them as such, we embrace them. But where the Bible is silent, we must be silent.
Now, is there any other proof that we can look at? Because in the Bible, Jehovah made it pretty clear who he had chosen to lead his people. We can find at least 3 indicators of this in the Bible. The first being miracles. Jehovah used miraculous works to identify those that he chose to take the lead. like with Moses summoning the plagues on Egypt, or the apostles speaking in tongues and healing the sick, and especially with Jesus when he resurrected Lazarus or turned the water into wine. Has the governing body ever demonstrated the gift of miraculous works? Another indicator is prophecy. Jehovah used prophets to direct his people, like Daniel's prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar going mad for 7 times, or when Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. We do actually have a written record in Watchtower publication of all of their predictions for the future, like their predictions about 1914, 1925, and 1975, just to name a few. 100% of Watchtower's predictions have failed. And our final indicator is consistency. All Christian religions, including the Organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, claim the Bible writers to be harmonious and consistent with all of their writings and teachings, free of contradictions, proving that they had Jehovah's direction. This is absolutely not the case, with the Watchtower Society's teachings and biblical understandings constantly changing. In fact, this very teaching of the faithful and discreet slave changed at least 5 different times throughout Watchtower's history. Beginning with the teaching that the faithful slave was the 144,000 anointed. Then, it was Charles Taze Russell. Then, it was the 144,000 again, but this time with Jesus. Then, back again to only the 144,000, and finally settling on the faithful slave being only the governing body. Once again, there seems to be no proof or biblical precedent that Jesus spoke prophetically about the appointment of a faithful slave to lead his people at some future time. I also wanted to briefly touch on one more point. If you notice across Watchtower publications, when talking about the doctrine of the faithful and discreet slave, they almost always go with the scripture in Matthew and very rarely mention the one in Luke. This is because the one in Matthew is the one where Jesus begins the chapter by foretelling future events and the sign of his presence, and the Watchtower Society needs that to be able to try and loosely connect it to that prophecy. You may have also noticed that whenever they bring up the faithful slave teaching in Matthew, they always stop at verse 47. This is because from verse 48 to the end of the chapter, it talks about an evil slave. And if this whole thing actually is a prophecy, then that would mean that Jesus would have also been predicting a future appearance by an evil slave. Now, in order to explain this away, the Society conveniently says that the evil slave isn't meant to be taken literally. It's more of a metaphorical warning for the faithful and discreet slave. In the information box at the bottom of the same 2013 Watchtower that we looked at earlier, it says this: Jesus warned about an evil slave who concludes in his heart that the master is delaying and who starts to beat his fellow slaves. His words here are actually a warning directed to the faithful and discreet slave. Okay, so let's assume for one moment that this whole doctrine is actually accurate. Jesus was speaking prophetically, and the governing body was selected to be the faithful and discreet slave. If Jesus' words about an evil slave were actually a warning, and there exists even the slightest chance that the faithful slave can turn into the evil slave and beat his fellow slaves, shouldn't we be even more determined to double-check and scrutinize their claims? To verify that what they're telling us is true, and to make sure that we're not being fooled? For all we know, maybe the evil slave is already here and beating his fellow slaves. We'll never know unless we start looking into it, especially if you are a believing Jehovah's Witness and you take Jesus' warning very seriously. Let's review. When examining the second claim to authority made by the organization that Jesus predicted a small group of men that would lead the entire Christian congregation and fulfill the prophecy of the faithful and discreet slave, we saw that this teaching lacks any biblical backing, and we weren't able to find proof of any kind. We saw that the context of Jesus' words about the faithful slave in both Matthew and Luke show that these are simply parables and have no prophetic meaning. It also makes sense that the disciples would have viewed it as a parable about being on the watch and faithful to Jesus, and not as a prophecy. We also saw the Watchtower Society's stance on types and antitypes, admitting that we can't go beyond what is written and should not be looking for prophetic types where the Bible doesn't clearly specify it. The teaching of the faithful slave, therefore, cannot be true. We also saw that there is no proof at all of the fulfillment of any prophecy regarding the faithful slave, and that the Organization of Jehovah's Witnesses fails to demonstrate any of the 3 biblical indicators that they are actually being used by Jehovah. And lastly, we saw that if Jesus' words about an evil slave was indeed a warning, we should be even more determined to look into and investigate the claims made by the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. The simple truth is that upon examining the teaching of the faithful and discreet slave, we find no biblical precedent for it, and no proof is offered to back it up. The reason why they continue teaching this, despite it not holding up to scrutiny, becomes painfully obvious. Without these claims to authority, they become powerless. They cherry-pick scriptures like the ones found in Matthew and Luke and apply this bizarre reasoning and meaning that just doesn't make any sense. For many of us raised as Jehovah's Witnesses, these men having authority over our lives and our spiritual future is all that we know. That's why examinations into their claims like these are important. Finding out what is true and what isn't is incredibly important, even if that truth leads us to conclusions that go against the teachings and doctrines that we grew up with and once held dear.
Our love should be for the truth and not for a particular doctrine or teaching.
Thank you guys again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Special shout out to all of my patrons who are helping to support my work, and if you'd also like to support my channel and the work that I'm doing here, please consider becoming a Patreon over at patreon.com/jwreview. See you guys next time, and thanks again for watching.